My name is Ethan Cole, and I'm 29 years old. This happened last summer in Palo Duro Canyon, Texas, the kind of trip you plan to escape life for a bit, to reconnect with old friends. But I'm telling you now, if you ever think about camping out there, don't. Just don't. It was supposed to be simple, a weekend reunion with people I hadn't seen in years. We rented an old RV, stocked it with beer, snacks, and enough camping gear to last a week if we wanted. I thought we were just going to hike, drink, and maybe hash out some of the old tensions between me and Jenna, but nothing could have prepared us for what really happened. We rolled into Palo Duro late on a Friday afternoon. The canyon stretched out beneath us, glowing orange in the dying sunlight, its cliffs jagged and towering like ancient, broken teeth. The place was beautiful, sure, but there was something off. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't put my finger on. It was me, Jenna, Mike, Sarah, and Kyle. Jenna was my ex, and yeah, things between us were tense. We hadn't really talked since the breakup, but Sarah, the eternal peacemaker, convinced us to bury the hatchet for this trip. Mike, our loud, reckless friend, was already cracking beers before we even set up camp. Sarah stuck close to him, her nervous laugh betraying something deeper between them. Kyle was the quiet one, an old college roommate of mine who tagged along last minute. He didn't fit in with the rest of us, but I didn't question it then. We found a spot off one of the lesser-known trails, away from the usual campsites. Mike insisted it'd be more authentic. The sun dipped below the horizon as we set up, and that's when the first thing went wrong. The RV blew a tire. "Guess we're not going anywhere for a while," Mike laughed, kicking the flat. No one else laughed. We decided to make the best of it. We built a fire, passed around drinks, and tried to ignore the nagging tension. But as the night deepened, the canyon changed. It wasn't just dark. It felt like the canyon swallowed the light. The fire flickered weakly against the oppressive blackness, and every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves sent a jolt down my spine. Then we heard it. A faint chanting, low, rhythmic, like a song carried on the wind. We all froze. "You hear that?" Sarah whispered. Mike stood up, squinting into the darkness. Probably some other campers messing around. But it didn't sound like campers. It sounded ancient, primal. We tried to shake it off, but none of us slept well that night. The next morning, Mike convinced us to hike deeper into the canyon. He claimed he saw someone watching us from the ridge the night before, said it was probably some local messing with us. I didn't believe him, but we followed anyway, mostly to shut him up. That's when we started seeing the symbols. Strange carvings on trees and rocks, spirals, crude stick figures, and what looked like runes. Kyle dismissed it as local art, but I wasn't so sure. The deeper we went, the more symbols we saw, and the more uneasy I felt. Then Mike disappeared. One minute he was ahead of us, cracking jokes, and the next, he was gone. We called out for him, our voices echoing off the canyon walls, but there was no answer. After an hour of searching, we found him. He was sprawled at the base of a cliff, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. His shirt was torn, and his eyes were wild with fear. They were watching me," he stammered. "Masks, made of bones." We dragged him back to camp, but something had changed. Mike wasn't the same. He was jumpy, paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder. That night, while Sarah tried to calm him down, we heard the chanting again, closer this time. And then Sarah disappeared. We woke up to find her side of the tent empty, her sleeping bag tossed aside like she'd been yanked out of it. But it was her phone that really got to us. It was propped against a rock near the fire, screen cracked, still recording. I wish I hadn't watched that video. Sarah was tied to a post, her face streaked with tears and dirt. She was whispering something, begging for help. Behind her, shadowy figures moved, their faces hidden behind grotesque masks made of bone and animal hides. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied, until the video cut out. That's when Kyle made his move. While Jenna and I were arguing about what to do next, Kyle blindsided me, knocking me to the ground. When I came to, I was tied up in the RV, blood trickling from my temple. Jenna was gone. Mike was slumped in the corner, his hand mangled and bleeding, his eyes glassy with pain. "You think you're better than me, Ethan?" Kyle sneered, standing over me. "You always had everything handed to you. I'm just evening the score." I didn't understand, not then, but as he ranted, the pieces fell into place. Kyle had led us here. He was part of this cult, or whatever it was. He'd lured us into the canyon as sacrifices. He left me there, tied up and helpless, while he delivered Jenna to those monsters. Mike stirred, groaning, and I realized he was still alive. Barely. I don't know how I managed it, but I got us free. Mike was too weak to move, his mind shattered from whatever they'd done to him. I left him there, knowing I'd probably never see him again. I followed the sounds, the chanting, the screams, deeper into the canyon. My heart pounding in my chest, I found them in a network of caves, hidden beneath the cliffs. The cultists were gathered around a fire, their masks gleaming in the flickering light. And there, tied to a post just like in the video, were Jenna and Sarah. I don't remember much of what happened next. It was a blur of blood and fire, of screams and bone. I fought like a man possessed, fueled by fear and rage. I found Kyle in the chaos and we fought, really fought. It was brutal, messy. I left him bleeding in the dirt, but not before he laughed in my face. "You'll never escape," he whispered. "They'll always find you." But I did escape. I got Jenna and Sarah out of those caves and we ran like hell. We didn't stop until we saw the lights of a ranger station in the distance. Mike didn't make it. They found his body in the RV, or what was left of it. The cops never found the cult. They searched the canyon, but it was like they'd vanished into thin air. No masks, no symbols, nothing. Just the scars they left behind. I still hear the chanting sometimes in my dreams. And sometimes, when the night is too quiet, I swear I see those masks in the shadows. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 29 years old, and I'll never go back to Palo Duro Canyon. My name is Lena Hart. I'm 34 years old, and what I'm about to tell you happened in Sam Houston National Forest, Texas. I thought I was just going on a solo RV trip for work, but I was wrong. I should have never gone into those woods. I'd been freelancing as a travel writer for a couple of years, and this trip was supposed to be simple. An article about the most isolated places in Texas. I picked Sam Houston National Forest because of its reputation. Dense pine woods, miles of trails, and not a soul around for days. Perfect for a piece about solitude. But if I'm honest, I needed the isolation. After the divorce, after losing the baby, I just needed to get away, clear my head, be alone with my thoughts. I rolled into the park late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping low, casting long shadows through the towering pines. My RV rattled over the gravel path, dust kicking up behind me. I found a spot off one of the lesser-used trails, parked, and shut off the engine. The silence was immediate, pressing. I liked it. No cars, no city noise, just me and the woods. I spent that first evening setting up camp and jotting down notes for my article. I wasn't scared, not yet, but when night fell, the forest changed. The air felt heavier, like it was thick with something unseen. I brushed it off as nerves, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat outside under the stars. That's when I heard it. A soft, distant crying. It sounded like a woman, or maybe a child, somewhere in the woods. I froze, my glass halfway to my lips. I listened, straining to hear over the pounding in my ears. The crying came again, closer this time. I stood up, my heart racing. "Hello," I called into the darkness, but there was no answer, just the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. I told myself it was probably an animal or maybe another camper, but I hadn't seen anyone else when I arrived. I shook it off, went inside the RV, and locked the door. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I found something strange. Near the edge of my campsite, carved into the trunk of a pine tree, was a symbol. It looked like a spiral, surrounded by crude stick figures. I'd never seen anything like it before. It wasn't graffiti, too old, too precise. It felt ancient. I took a picture for my article, trying to stay professional, but something about it made my skin crawl. I decided to hike one of the nearby trails, hoping to shake the unease. But the forest didn't want to let me go. My GPS kept glitching, no matter how far I walked. It showed me looping back to the same spot over and over, like I was trapped in some kind of maze. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. Then I saw her. A woman in a white dress, standing just beyond the trees. Her hair was long and dark, covering most of her face. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. I blinked, and she was gone. I told myself I was imagining things. Grief can mess with your head. But when I got back to the RV, my journal was missing, and so was the photo of the baby I'd lost. That night, the crying came back, louder this time. Closer. I stayed inside, clutching a flashlight, staring at the door like it might burst open at any moment. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed up my things, started the RV, and nothing happened. The battery was dead, completely drained. I hadn't left anything on, hadn't done anything to cause it. But the RV wasn't going anywhere. I tried calling for help, but my phone had no signal. The radio was just static. I was stranded. That's when I met Tom. He came out of the woods, a rugged-looking guy in his 40s, wearing a camo jacket and carrying a hunting rifle. At first, I was relieved, a real person, someone who could help. "You all right, miss?" he asked, his voice rough like gravel. "My RV won't start," I said, "and my phone's dead. Can you help me?" He nodded slowly. "I can try, but you shouldn't be out here alone. These woods, they're not safe." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, glancing around like the trees were listening. "You heard her, didn't you? The woman crying." My blood ran cold. "What do you know about her?" Tom sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "They say she's a ghost. Been haunting these woods for years. Lures people off the trails. My brother, he followed her once, never saw him again." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to believe it was all nonsense, but deep down, I knew he was telling the truth. I could see it in his eyes. "Come on," he said. "I've got a cabin not far from here. We'll figure something out." I didn't have a choice. I followed him into the woods, my gut twisting with every step. His cabin was small, run down, but it felt safer than the RV, or so I thought. We sat by the fire, and Tom told me more about the woman. How she was said to be a settler's wife who'd gone mad after losing her child. How she'd wandered into the woods, crying for her baby until she died. And how her spirit never left, still searching, still crying. As he talked, I noticed something strange. Symbols carved into the walls of his cabin, the same symbols I'd seen on the tree. That's when I realized I'd made a mistake. Tom wasn't trying to help me. He was part of it. I stood up, my heart racing. "I need to go," I said, backing toward the door. But Tom blocked my way, his eyes dark and wild. "You can't leave," he whispered. "She needs you. Maybe if I give her you, she'll give me my brother back." I ran. I don't know how I did it, but I fought him off and bolted into the woods. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. The trees blurred past me, branches tearing at my skin. I could hear Tom behind me, shouting, but his voice faded into the distance. And then I saw her again, the woman in white, standing in the clearing, her face pale and twisted with sorrow. She held something in her arms, something small, wrapped in cloth. A baby, but it wasn't real. I knew it wasn't real. She whispered my name, her voice soft and cold like the wind through the trees. "Lena." I squeezed my eyes shut, shaking my head. "You're not real," I whispered. "You're not real." But when I opened my eyes, she was closer. Her face was inches from mine, her eyes hollow and empty. I ran again, my lungs burning, my legs screaming with pain. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled onto a dirt road. A ranger's truck was coming down the path, and I waved frantically, sobbing with relief. They didn't find Tom's cabin. They didn't find the woman. But they found my RV just where I left it. And the photo of my baby was sitting on the dashboard, right where it hadn't been before. I got out of those woods, but I didn't leave her behind. I still hear her sometimes in the dead of night, soft crying just outside my window. And I know she's still looking for me. My name is Mark Davis. I'm 42 years old, and this happened last spring at Devil's River in southwest Texas. I've seen some dark things in my life, served 2 tours overseas, but nothing ever prepared me for what I encountered out there. After retiring from the Army, I thought the hardest part would be adjusting to civilian life. Turns out, it's harder to outrun your own mind. The guilt, the nightmares, they follow you no matter where you go. So I packed up my old RV, grabbed my dog Rex, and hit the road, hoping the isolation would quiet things down. Devil's River was supposed to be peaceful, but I didn't know what was waiting for me. We got there late in the afternoon. The sun was low, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. The river was beautiful, crystal clear water cutting through rugged cliffs and wild, untouched land. No cell signal, no people for miles. Just me, Rex, and the open land. I parked the RV on a flat patch near the riverbank, cracked open a beer, and let Rex wander while I set up camp. The air was dry and still, but there was something heavy about it, like the ground itself was holding its breath. I chalked it up to nerves. Being alone always felt better than being around people, but it had its downsides. Too much quiet, and your mind starts filling in the blanks. That night, the temperature dropped fast. I was bundled up inside the RV when Rex started growling. Low, deep, the kind of sound that makes your skin prickle. I sat up, listening, but all I heard was the wind rattling the RV. I told Rex to settle down, but he wouldn't move from the door, his ears pinned back, teeth bared at nothing. I figured it was a coyote or maybe a mountain lion, but when I stepped outside with my flashlight, the desert was empty. Just the river glinting under the moonlight, and the distant rustle of wind through dry brush. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The next morning, I found strange symbols carved into the rocks near the river. Circles with lines running through them, like old runes or something. I'd seen plenty of weird crap overseas, but this was different. It felt old, like it didn't belong to this time. Rex wouldn't go near the carvings. He barked and whined, pulling on his leash whenever we got close. I snapped a photo for no good reason. Habit, I guess. Maybe part of me thought I'd look them up later, convince myself it was just some local graffiti. But deep down, I knew better. I spent the day fishing and trying to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. But the air felt heavier with each passing hour, like the land itself was pressing down on me. The river, once so clear and inviting, now looked murky, almost like it was hiding something beneath the surface. That night, the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind. But then I heard my name, Mark. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest as I strained to hear. Rex was growling again, pacing by the door, his hackles raised. The voice came again, soft and low, drifting through the air like smoke. Mark, help us. It sounded like them. My squad, the ones I lost on that last mission, their voices calling out from the dark. But that was impossible. I knew it was impossible. I told myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I stepped outside, flashlight cutting through the dark, I saw them. Figures in the distance, standing by the river motionless, their faces pale in the moonlight. I couldn't make out their features, but I knew them. I knew every one of them. Cooper, I whispered, stepping forward. Jackson? They didn't move, didn't say a word, just stood there, staring. Rex barked, snapping me out of it. I blinked, and the figures were gone, just like that, gone. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat with my back against it, clutching my rifle. But the whispers didn't stop. They went on all night, seeping into my head like poison. The next morning, Rex was gone. I woke up to find the door wide open, the leash chewed through. His tracks led down to the river, then disappeared. I called for him until my voice was raw, but the only response was the echo of my own shouting. I packed up, ready to get the hell out of there. But when I tried to start the RV, nothing happened. The battery was dead, completely drained, like it had been running all night. But I knew it hadn't. Panic set in. I checked my supplies. Half of them were missing. Food, water, even my map. It didn't make sense. I was organized, always had been. I didn't just lose things. Then I saw the message. Scrawled across the windshield in what looked like dried blood were the words, "You can't leave." That's when I knew I wasn't just dealing with ghosts. This was something else. Something older. Something darker. I grabbed my pack, my rifle, and followed Rex's tracks back to the river. I didn't care what was out there, I just wanted my dog back. But the river wasn't the same. It twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, leading me in circles. My compass spun wildly, useless. The desert around me shifted, like the land itself was alive, trying to keep me trapped. And then I found it, an old campsite half buried in sand and dirt. The tents were torn, stained with blood. Bones were scattered around, picked clean by the sun and the elements. But there were no bodies, just remnants. In the center of the camp was an altar, a crude slab of stone, covered in the same symbols I'd seen carved into the rocks. And on that altar was Rex. Or what used to be Rex. His eyes were wrong, glassy, lifeless, but still staring at me. His body twitched unnaturally, like something else was controlling it. And when he growled, it wasn't his growl. It was something deeper, something not of this world. Mark? The voice came again, but it wasn't just in my ears, it was in my head, crawling under my skin, sinking into my bones. You left them. You let them die. Now it's your turn. I raised my rifle, hands shaking. But it wasn't Rex's face I saw, it was Cooper's, then Jackson's. One by one, their faces flickered over Rex's, each one blaming me, accusing me. You can't leave. I pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the canyon, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then the ground shook, a deep, guttural sound rising from beneath the earth. The altar cracked, and a dark, oily substance seeped out, staining the ground. I ran. I don't remember how, But I ran until my legs gave out, until the sun was high in the sky and the river was just a distant memory. I stumbled onto a dirt road where a passing truck found me, half mad and covered in blood. They didn't believe my story. Hell, I wouldn't believe it either. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I still hear them calling my name. My name is Mark Bennett. I'm 32 years old, and this happened in October of last year. I still don't know if I believe what I saw or what I did, but it's real enough that I wake up screaming most nights. Real enough that I haven't looked in a mirror in months. It started as a simple camping trip. Just me, my old college buddy Luis, and the wild stretches of Palo Duro Canyon in the Texas Panhandle. He'd been begging me to take a break from my job in Dallas, said I was working myself into an early grave. Maybe he was right. So I caved. Thought a weekend in the wilderness would clear my head. I was dead wrong. We rented this beat-up RV thinking we'd save some cash. Luis was always the thrifty one. The thing rattled like it'd fall apart on the highway, and the AC gave out halfway through the drive. But the real problem started when we entered the canyon. The land out there is beautiful in a way that makes your skin crawl. Towering red cliffs, jagged rock formations, and silence that presses on your ears like a weight. We drove deeper into the park, looking for a secluded spot. No cell service, no way to call for help if something went wrong. But we didn't think about that. Not then. We set up camp near the base of a cliff where the shadows stretched long and dark. That first night we sat by the fire, drinking cheap beer and reminiscing about college. Luis laughed easily, his face glowing in the firelight, but there was a tension under the surface I couldn't ignore. "You ever think about Jenna?" he asked suddenly, his voice softer. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Jenna, his girlfriend now, but before that, before Luis even met her, there had been a night. One night, and I'd buried it deep where I thought it had never come out. I forced a shrug. Not really. He looked at me for a long time like he was searching for something in my face. Then he laughed it off, but the mood had shifted. Later that night, as we tried to sleep in the RV, I heard it. The first sign that something wasn't right. A scream, faint and distant, echoing off the canyon walls. It didn't sound human, not exactly, too high-pitched, too twisted. "You hear that?" I whispered, sitting up in my sleeping bag. Luis stirred, groggy. Coyotes, probably. But his voice lacked a conviction. We tried to brush it off, but sleep didn't come easy. The next day, we hiked deeper into the canyon, following a narrow, winding trail. The air felt heavier the further we went, like the canyon itself was pressing down on us. Midway through the hike, we stumbled upon it. A campsite abandoned, with a tent shredded to ribbons. Blood stained the dirt, dark and sticky, and nearby, half buried under rocks and leaves, was a body. Or what was left of one. The face was torn, the skin stretched tight over sharp bones, and parts of the flesh had been eaten. Luis gagged, stumbling back. "Jesus Christ, we need to call someone." But we had no service. We could have hiked back, but something in me, some stupid, stubborn pride, told me to keep going. "We'll report it when we get out. Let's not panic." That was my first mistake. By the time we got back to the RV, the sun was setting, painting the canyon walls in blood-red light. I felt strange. My skin itched and my stomach twisted with a hunger I couldn't explain. That night, things got worse. I woke up to find dirt under my nails and blood on my shirt, no idea how it got there. Luis stared at me like I'd grown another head. "Mark, you were sleepwalking. You went out last night. I tried to stop you, but you were different. You wouldn't listen." I didn't believe him. I couldn't. But then I started hearing the whispers, the hunger. They slithered into my mind when I was awake, when I was asleep. A voice, not mine, telling me to feed. Luis noticed the change. He started keeping his distance, eyeing me like I was a wild animal. The tension between us snapped when he confronted me about Jenna. "I know what you did," he hissed, his face twisted in anger. "Before we got together, you think I didn't figure it out?" I opened my mouth to deny it, but what was the point? The truth hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. "You're losing it, man," he said. "We need to get out of here. You're not right." But it was too late for that. That night, the voices were louder, screaming in my skull. When I woke up, Luis was gone. For a moment, I thought he'd left me behind. But then I saw the trail of blood leading from the RV into the darkness. I followed it, heart pounding in my chest, until I found him. Luis was tied to a tree, blood dripping from cuts along his arms and legs. His face was pale, eyes wide with fear, and the worst part, I had done it. I didn't remember, but the knife was in my hand, my fingerprints on the handle. "Mark, please. This isn't you," he whispered, his voice weak. But the hunger roared in my head, drowning out his words. I felt it in my bones, in my blood, the need to consume. I raised the knife, but something inside me, some tiny, flickering part of who I used to be, fought back. I dropped the blade and stumbled away, gasping for air. Luis managed to free himself, but the damage was done. We tried to leave the canyon the next morning, but the RV wouldn't start. The road was blocked by a rock slide from the storm the night before. We were trapped. The final confrontation happened that night. Luis cornered me near the fire, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. "It's inside you, Mark. You're turning into that thing." I could feel it, the Wendigo. It wasn't just a story, it was real, and it wanted me. Luis pulled out the knife, the same one I'd used on him. "You need to fight it, or I will." I looked at him, at the man who had been my best friend, and felt the hunger clawing at my insides. "Kill me," I whispered, "or I'll kill you." He hesitated, just long enough for me to lunge. The fight was brutal. I don't remember all of it, just flashes, blood, pain, screaming. In the end, he stabbed me. I collapsed, the hunger fading as the life drained from me. But as I lay there, dying, I saw his face twist into something else, something monstrous. The Wendigo hadn't just wanted me, it wanted both of us. When I woke up, Luis was gone. The RV was still there, the canyon silent and empty. I managed to drive out eventually, but I haven't seen him since. Sometimes, late at night, I hear his voice in my head, whispering, "The hunger never ends." My name is Claire Dawson. I'm 28 years old, and what happened to me at Lake Livingston still haunts me. I've told myself it wasn't real, that maybe it was all in my head, but some nights, when everything goes quiet, I can still hear him calling my name. This was supposed to be a simple trip. After a messy breakup with my fiancé, I decided to take my RV across Texas, documenting the journey for my travel blog. It was part therapy, part work. Just me, nature, and the open road. Lake Livingston was supposed to be peaceful, a quick stop before heading deeper into East Texas, but peace was the last thing I found there. I arrived at the park in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the dense pine trees. The lake stretched out like a sheet of dark glass, perfectly still. I chose the most remote campsite I could find, far from the other visitors. I wanted solitude. I thought I needed it. The first day went as planned. I kayaked along the shore, the water cool and calm beneath me. I snapped photos of the towering trees reflected on the lake's surface, the quiet beauty of the place wrapping around me like a blanket. But even then, something felt off. The air was heavy, too still, like the forest was holding its breath. That night, as I sat by the fire, the only sounds were the crackle of burning wood and the occasional splash from the lake. I told myself it was probably fish or maybe a raccoon scavenging along the shore. But when I crawled into my RV and lay down to sleep, I heard something else. It started as a faint whisper, so soft I thought it was the wind sneaking through the trees. But then it grew louder, more distinct, a voice. His voice. "Claire!" I shot up, my heart pounding in my chest. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. "Claire! I'm sorry." It was Jason, my ex-fiancé. His voice was coming from outside the RV. I scrambled to the window and peered out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, just the faint glow of the dying fire. But then, near the edge of the water, I saw a figure. Tall, thin, and unmistakably him. Jason. My breath caught in my throat. He was supposed to be in Austin. We hadn't spoken since I left. What the hell was he doing here? I grabbed my flashlight and yanked open the door, stepping out into the cool night air. "Jason?" I called, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move, it just stood there staring at me. I shined the light toward him, but as the beam hit the spot where he was standing, there was nothing there. Just empty shoreline. I froze, my skin crawling. I knew what I saw, I knew his voice, but he was gone. I backed into the RV, locked the door, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was tired, or maybe it was the wind playing tricks on me. But when I stepped outside, I saw footprints in the damp dirt by the water. Barefoot, leading right up to where I saw him. I told myself I'd leave that day. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. I checked my phone. No signal, even though I had full bars the night before. Panic started to creep in, but I forced it down. I'd seen a ranger station a few miles back. I could hike there, get help. I packed a small bag, grabbed my map, and started down the trail. But something was wrong. The trail markers I'd seen the day before were gone, or maybe moved. I found myself walking in circles, the dense forest closing in around me. After hours of wandering, I stumbled back into my own campsite. I hadn't gone anywhere. I was losing my mind. That night, the whispers came back, louder this time, closer. "Claire, why did you leave me?" I lay in my bed, covers pulled up to my chin, staring at the ceiling, trying to block out his voice. But then I heard something else. Scratching. On the side of the RV. I held my breath, listening. The scratching moved along the wall, slow and deliberate, like fingernails dragging across metal. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window, my hands shaking. When I looked out, my heart nearly stopped. There, by the water, was Jason. But something was wrong. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were hollow. Dark pits that seemed to suck in the light. His mouth twisted into a smile that wasn't his. "Come to me, Claire," he whispered. I slammed the curtain shut and backed away, my chest tight with fear. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the next morning, I found symbols carved into the trees around my campsite. Strange, twisting shapes that made my head hurt just looking at them. And floating near the shore was a journal, waterlogged and torn. I pulled it out, flipping through the soggy pages. It belonged to someone named Sarah. Another camper from years ago. Her last entry read, "The woman in the water wants me. She showed me his face. I think I'll go to him tonight." I dropped the journal, my stomach turning. I had to get out. I tried everything. I tore down the symbols, thinking maybe they were some kind of curse. I even tried walking into the lake, thinking maybe if I faced whatever this was, it would let me go. But the moment I stepped into the water, I felt a pull, like something was trying to drag me under. I barely made it back to shore. That night, the whispers didn't come from outside. They were inside the RV. "Claire, I forgive you," I screamed, backing into the corner, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. And then I saw her. She wasn't Jason. She wasn't even human. The hag stood in the middle of the RV, her body gaunt and twisted, the skin hanging in loose, wet folds. Her eyes were black holes, her mouth stretched into a grin full of jagged, yellow teeth. "Come to me," she hissed. I don't remember grabbing the flare gun, but the next thing I knew, I was firing it at her. The flare exploded in bright, blinding light, and the hag let out a scream that rattled the walls. She vanished, but the fire had caught on the RV's curtains, spreading fast. I stumbled out, coughing, watching as the flames licked up the sides of the RV and into the trees. The fire lit up the lake, and in the glow, I saw them. Bodies, dozens of them, floating just beneath the surface. Their faces were frozen in terror, their eyes wide and staring. I ran. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, flagged down a passing car, and never looked back. I posted one last entry on my blog, warning people to stay away from Lake Livingston. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that she's still out there, waiting. And sometimes, when the night is quiet and the wind is just right, I still hear him. "Claire, come back to me." My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 35 years old, and I used to be a paramedic. What happened to me on Devil's Backbone last year, I can't explain it. I don't know if it was real or just my mind unraveling, but I know one thing for sure. I didn't leave that place the same person who went in. I'd been drifting around Texas for months after my divorce, living out of my beat-up RV. I told people I was just exploring, but the truth was, I was running. From my past, from the job, from the night I watched my best friend die and couldn't do a damn thing about it. Her name was Sarah. I still see her face when I close my eyes. Devil's Backbone wasn't on my original route. I'd heard the name before. Locals whispered about ghosts and strange disappearances, but that didn't scare me. Ghost stories were for people who hadn't seen real death up close. I figured the solitude might help clear my head. I parked the RV at a pull-off spot overlooking the ridge. The view was stunning in a way that made your skin crawl. Rolling hills covered in scrubby oaks, limestone cliffs glowing under the setting sun. The air felt heavier there, like the land was holding onto something old and angry. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some canned chili, cracked open a beer, and sat outside watching the sky bleed from orange to black. The stars were brighter than I'd ever seen, but the silence felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. When I finally went to bed, I thought maybe this place wasn't so bad after all. I was wrong. Around 3 a.m, I woke up to a faint tapping on the RV window. It was subtle, almost polite, like someone didn't want to disturb me but couldn't resist. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe a tree branch brushing against the glass. But when I finally worked up the nerve to peek through the curtain, there was nothing there. The next morning, I found bloody handprints smeared across the driver's side window. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. They were fresh, dark red, slightly tacky to the touch. But there were no footprints in the dirt around the RV, no signs anyone had been there. I should have packed up and left right then, but something kept me there. Maybe I thought I could outrun my guilt by confronting whatever the hell was going on. I spent the day hiking the trails that crisscrossed the ridge, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying voices that sounded just like hers. Ethan. I told myself it was just my imagination, but every time I turned around I swore I saw her, Sarah, disappearing into the trees just out of reach. By the time I got back to the RV, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. I tried to start the engine, thinking maybe I'd had enough, but the damn thing sputtered and died. The battery was fine, the gas tank was full, it just wouldn't start. That's when the radio crackled to life even though I hadn't touched it. At first, it was just static, but then a voice cut through, garbled, distorted, but unmistakably her voice. "You let me die, Ethan." I ripped the keys from the ignition, but the radio kept playing, Sarah's voice growing louder, angrier. I yanked the battery cables loose, and finally, the RV went silent. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found newspaper clippings tucked under the windshield wipers. They were old, yellowed with age, detailing people who'd vanished along Devil's Backbone. Hikers, campers, even a family who'd been traveling in an RV just like mine. Their bodies were never found. I don't remember putting them there, but I must have, right? Who else could have done it? That evening, as the sun dipped low, I saw him. A man standing in the middle of the road, thumbing for a ride. He was tall, lean, wearing a tattered coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Against my better judgment, I walked toward him, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. "You're a long way from anywhere," I said. The man smiled, and it sent a chill down my spine. "So are you." I stopped a few feet from him, suddenly aware of how alone I was out here. "You need something?" He tilted his head, studying me like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve. "I think it's you who need something, Ethan." I took a step back. "How do you know my name?" He chuckled, a low, hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. "I know a lot about you, about Sarah." My blood ran cold. "What do you want?" The man's grin widened. "I'm here to offer you a deal. Confess your sins, face what you've done, and I'll let you go. But if you keep running, well, the backbone has a way of holding on to folks like you." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me. But the man's words echoed in my head. That night, I saw her again. Sarah stood by the edge of the cliff, her back to me, her dark hair whipping in the wind. She turned slowly, and my heart stopped. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, black holes that seemed to suck in the fading light. "You could have saved me," she whispered, "but you didn't." I fell to my knees, the weight of her words crushing me. "I tried," I choked out. "I did everything I could." But she just stared at me, unblinking. "You let me die." The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a chorus of voices, all accusing, all screaming. I stumbled back to the RV, locked the doors, and curled up on the floor, my mind unraveling. I don't know how long I lay there before I heard it again, the tapping on the window. This time, I didn't look. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I grabbed the bottle of whiskey I kept stashed under the sink and hiked back to the ridge where I'd seen Sarah. The man in the hat was waiting for me, leaning against a tree with that same unsettling smile. "Decided to take my offer?" he asked. I didn't answer. I walked to the edge of the cliff, staring down at the jagged rocks below. The wind whispered in my ear, promising release, promising peace. But then I saw her face again, not hollow, not angry, just Sarah, the way she looked the day we met, laughing, alive. I stepped back from the edge. "I'm not yours," I said, turning to the man. His smile faded, replaced by something darker, more sinister. "You'll never escape me, Ethan." I didn't respond. I just walked away. The RV started on the first try when I got back. I drove until the ridge was nothing but a speck in my rearview mirror. But even now, I hear the voices at night. I see Sarah's face in the shadows, and sometimes, when I'm alone, I catch a glimpse of a man in a wide-brimmed hat watching me from the corner of my eye. You can't outrun the devil, but maybe, just maybe, you can learn to live with him. My name is David Martin. I'm 42 years old, and this happened in the summer of 2023. I'm not a superstitious man. I don't believe in ghosts, hags, or whatever the hell people say lives out in those swamps, but something happened to my family at Caddo Lake, and whether you believe me or not, I'm telling you, nothing was ever the same after that trip. It was supposed to be a chance to fix things. Laura and I hadn't been on the same page in years. She was distant, cold. Emily, our 17-year-old daughter, hated us both. Jake, our youngest, was just trying to keep the peace. 10 years old and already more mature than the rest of us combined. I thought an RV trip to Caddo Lake might remind us of who we were before life got complicated. I invited Rick, too. My oldest friend from back when life was simple. He was rough around the edges. A drifter with a gambling problem. But he had a way of lightening the mood, or at least that's what I told myself. Laura didn't trust him. Emily couldn't stand him. Maybe I should have listened. The drive out to Caddo was long and hot. The RV's AC was struggling, and Laura's silence weighed heavier than the humid air outside. Emily was glued to her phone, her earbuds drowning us out. Jake was the only one excited, his nose pressed to the window, watching the dense trees and murky water as we got closer to the lake. We rolled into the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. It looked beautiful in that eerie, haunted kind of way. We parked near the edge of the lake, far from the other campers. I thought the isolation would help us reconnect. It didn't. The first night was tense. We sat around a small fire eating burnt hot dogs while mosquitoes feasted on us. Rick cracked a few jokes trying to break the ice, but Laura wasn't biting. Emily rolled her eyes at everything he said and eventually stormed off into the RV, slamming the door behind her. "She'll come around," Rick muttered, sipping from his flask. "She's 17, Laura snapped. "She doesn't need some washed-up loser giving her life advice." Rick chuckled, but there was an edge to it. I shot Laura a look, but she was already turning away, heading toward the RV. I stayed behind with Rick and Jake, staring into the fire until the logs burned down to embers. That night, Jake woke me up. "Dad," he whispered, shaking my shoulder. "There's a lady in the water." I sat up, rubbing my eyes. The RV was dark, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the shore outside. "What are you talking about, buddy?" "I saw her," he insisted. She was whispering to me through the window. I glanced over at Laura, but she was asleep, or pretending to be. I sighed and grabbed the flashlight. "Show me." Jake led me outside. The air was thick with mist, the trees looming like silent sentinels. We walked to the edge of the lake, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing, just the still black water reflecting the moonlight. "See? No lady," I said, ruffling his hair. Jake frowned. "She was here, I swear." I chalked it up to his overactive imagination and led him back to bed. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the creaks of the RV settling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from out there in the trees. The next morning, the RV wouldn't start. "Shit," I muttered, banging my fist on the steering wheel. Rick leaned over my shoulder. "Sounds like the starter's fried. We're gonna need a tow." Of course, there was no cell signal. We were miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but swamp and trees. Rick suggested walking to a nearby bait shop he'd noticed on the way in. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The bait shop was a rundown shack with peeling paint and a crooked sign that read, "Jed's Bait and Tackle." Inside, it smelled like stale beer and dead fish. The man behind the counter was tall and thin with a scraggly beard and eyes that didn't quite match his smile. "You folks lost?" he asked, his voice slow and deliberate. I explained our situation and he nodded thoughtfully. "Got a buddy who can tow you out, but it'll take a while. Why don't y'all come by for supper tonight? My wife makes a mean catfish stew." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl, but Rick clapped me on the back, grinning. "Sounds like hospitality to me, am I?" We went back to the RV and I told Laura about Jed's invitation. She was immediately against it. "We don't even know these people," she hissed, "and you want to bring our kids to their house?" "It's just dinner," Rick said, flashing that charming smile. "What's the worst that could happen?" I should have known better. That evening, Emily stormed off after another fight with Laura. We figured she needed space, but when she didn't come back after an hour, panic set in. We split up to look for her, but the sun was setting fast, and the woods felt like they were closing in on us. Then we found her phone, just lying there near the water. The screen cracked, but still glowing faintly. No sign of Emily. Panic turned into terror. Rick suggested going to Jed's place for help. Desperate, I agreed. But when we got there, everything felt wrong. The house was too quiet. The windows were dark. Then the door swung open, and Jed stood there, smiling that same unsettling smile. "We've been expecting you," he said. Before I could react, something heavy slammed into the back of my head and everything went black. I woke up in a dark, damp room. My wrists were tied to a chair, my head pounding. I could hear Laura screaming somewhere nearby. Jake's terrified sobs echoed through the walls. Rick was there, standing with Jed and a group of locals, their faces twisted with sick glee. "You son of a bitch," I spat, struggling against the ropes. Rick shrugged. "Sorry, Dave, but I owed these folks a favor. And you brought them exactly what they needed." They dragged Laura in, her face bruised, eyes wild with fear. Jake was next, clutching her hand, his small body shaking. But Emily wasn't there. "They've got her," Jed said, his voice dripping with malice. "She's perfect for the offering." Offering. The word echoed in my head. They weren't just some backwoods cult. They worshipped something old and hungry. They broke my fingers one by one, laughing as I screamed. They told Laura they'd let Jake live if she watched them gut me like a pig. But Laura was stronger than I ever knew. She tricked Rick, whispered promises of escape, of starting over, and when he let his guard down, she slit his throat with a rusty knife, his blood spraying across the walls. We didn't have much time. Laura freed me, and we grabbed Jake, running through the swamp, the cult hot on our heels. The trees seemed to twist and shift, the fog thickening, making it impossible to tell where we were going. And then we saw her. Emily stood in the middle of the swamp, her clothes torn, her face pale but smiling. "Dad," she called, her voice too sweet, too perfect. "I'm okay." But something was wrong. Her eyes, they weren't Emily's eyes. Jake tugged at my sleeve, his voice a whisper. "That's not Emily." I wanted to believe it was. God, I wanted to. But deep down I knew. We dragged Jake away, leaving Emily, or whatever that thing was, standing there in the fog, her smile stretching too wide, too inhuman. We made it out, barely, but Emily's still out there. Or maybe she isn't. Maybe that thing took her place long before we ever got to Caddo Lake. And sometimes, late at night, I hear her voice whispering through the trees outside our window, calling me back. I don't think we ever really escaped. My name is Mark Holloway. I'm 38 years old, and what I'm about to tell you happened last fall along Devil's Backbone in Texas. I don't care if you believe me. Honestly, I'm not even sure if I believe it myself. But something followed me out of those hills, and I'm afraid it's still here. I've been traveling solo in my RV for the last year, documenting haunted places for my blog, Ghost Roads. After the divorce, it felt like the only thing I had left. Writing about ghost towns and cursed highways kept me from thinking about how empty my life had become. It was easier to chase shadows than face reality. When I heard about Devil's Backbone, a stretch of road with more ghost stories than mile markers, I knew it'd make the perfect post. The locals talked about phantom cowboys, spectral Confederate soldiers, even a hitchhiking woman in white. All great for clicks. But nobody mentioned what really haunts that place. I pulled into a turnout off the scenic drive, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the limestone cliffs in blood-red light. The RV sputtered a bit before I killed the engine. That should have been my first clue. I chalked it up to the rough terrain and grabbed my camera. The landscape was beautiful in that rugged, unforgiving way. Twisting trees, sharp rocks, and the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I took a few shots of the horizon before heading back to the RV. That's when I noticed the first weird thing. In one of the photos, there was someone standing by the edge of the road. Tall, wearing the same flannel shirt and jeans I had on. The problem, I was alone. I stared at the photo for a long time, telling myself it was a trick of the light or a glitch in the camera. But deep down, I knew better. I've been doing this long enough to recognize when something's off. Still, I wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. That night, the RV's electrical system went haywire. The lights flickered, the radio blared static, and the GPS kept recalculating even though I wasn't moving. I tried to laugh it off, just another spooky story for the blog, but when the radio cut through the static with my own voice whispering, "Mark," the laughter died in my throat. I turned everything off, sat in the dark, and told myself I was just tired. Maybe I'd had one too many beers while editing photos, but when I looked out the window, I saw him, standing by the tree line, just far enough that the shadows swallowed his face, but close enough that I could see he was wearing my clothes. I grabbed my flashlight and flung the door open, heart pounding. But when the beam hit the spot where he'd been, there was nothing. Just the empty road and the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I found muddy footprints outside the RV, the same size as mine. I told myself I'd walked around without realizing it. But the prints led away from the RV. I hadn't gone anywhere. I decided to leave, screw the blog post. I'd gotten enough material to fake a story later, but when I turned the key, the RV coughed and died. I tried again, nothing. Panic started to set in. I was miles from the nearest town with no cell service, stuck in the middle of nowhere. I remembered passing a rundown bar called the Backbone Tavern a few miles back. Maybe someone there could help. I locked up the RV and started walking. The bar was exactly what you'd expect. Dim lights, creaky floors, and the kind of silence that made you feel like you didn't belong. A few locals sat hunched over their drinks, eyes flicking toward me as I walked in. I approached the bartender, an older guy with a face like worn leather. "Truck trouble?" he asked, before I even opened my mouth. "Yeah," I said slowly. "RV won't start. You know anyone who can tow it?" He nodded toward a guy at the end of the bar. "Talk to Roy. He's got a rig." I thanked him and made my way over to Roy, a burly man with a thick beard and cold eyes. He agreed to help, but Something about the way he smiled made my skin crawl. As we drove back toward my RV in his beat-up truck, Roy asked, "You been out here long?" "Just overnight," I replied, staring out the window. Roy chuckled, a low, guttural sound. "Funny, I saw you out here last week. Same spot." I frowned. That wasn't me. He gave me a sideways glance. Could have fooled me. When we reached the RV, my stomach dropped. The door was wide open. I knew I'd locked it. Roy followed me inside, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. Everything was in place, except for the photos on my laptop. New pictures. Ones I didn't take. They were of me, sleeping, sitting at the table, staring blankly out the window. The timestamps were from times I couldn't remember, hours I thought I'd been awake. I turned to Roy, ready to demand answers, but the look in his eyes stopped me cold. He was staring at me like he'd seen a ghost. "You need to leave," he said quietly. "I'm trying," I snapped. "The RV won't start." He shook his head. "Not just here. You need to get out of the Backbone now, before it's too late." Before I could respond, he was gone. Just walked out and left me standing there, heart pounding in my chest. I slammed the door shut and locked it, though I knew it wouldn't do any good. The sun was setting and I could feel the darkness pressing in, thick and suffocating. That night, I heard him again. My own voice calling from the woods. "Mark, come out." I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to drown it out, but the whispers were inside my head, growing louder, more insistent. "Let me in." When I finally looked out the window, he was there. Standing inches from the glass, his face twisted into a grin that wasn't mine. His eyes were empty, black holes that seemed to suck in the light. I don't remember unlocking the door, but suddenly it was open, and he was inside. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like I was trapped in my own body, forced to watch as he reached for me. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in the driver's seat, the RV idling on the side of the road miles away from Devil's Backbone. I had no memory of how I got there. I should have felt relieved. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, my reflection didn't smile back. I've been on the road ever since, trying to outrun whatever followed me out of those hills. But I can still hear it sometimes, whispering in the dark. And I'm not sure how much longer I can tell the difference between me and him. My name is Cassandra Rivera. I'm 33 years old, and this happened in the desert outside of Marfa, Texas. I don't expect you to believe me. Hell, I barely believe it myself. But if you ever find yourself near that lonely stretch of road at night, and you see the lights dancing in the distance, don't stop. Keep driving, no matter what you hear. I wasn't supposed to be there long. Just a one-night stop on my way to Big Bend. I'd been on the road for months, traveling alone in my RV, writing for a survival blog. I preferred the solitude. People meant drama, and I'd had enough of that for a lifetime. I pulled into a remote gravel lot near the Marfa Lights viewing area, well away from the tourists. I didn't want company, just a night of quiet and maybe a chance to see the famous lights for myself. I figured I could turn it into a blog post. Survivalist's Guide to the Paranormal, or some bullshit like that. The first few hours were uneventful. The desert stretched endless and silent, the horizon glowing orange as the sun dipped below it. It was peaceful. Then, just as the last light faded, I saw them. At first, I thought they were headlights, but they floated, flickered, moving in ways headlights shouldn't. They split apart, merged again, pulsed like breathing. White, red, blue, shifting, stretching. Beautiful, almost hypnotic. I grabbed my camera and snapped a few pictures, but my screen only showed blackness. The lights didn't register. I should have left then. I went back inside the RV and locked the doors, but something felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy, like I was being watched. I chalked it up to my imagination. I was used to being alone, but the desert had a way of making you feel exposed, vulnerable. I lay in my bunk, listening to the wind whistle through the cracked windows until a sound snapped me upright. A knock, soft, hesitant. Not at the door, but at the window, the back window, the one above my bed. I held my breath. No one else had parked nearby. The knock came again. 3 slow taps. I turned my head just enough to see the reflection in the window's glass. There was someone standing outside. I grabbed my knife from under my pillow and slipped out of bed. My heart pounded as I edged toward the window, fingers gripping the handle so tight my knuckles ached. The person outside didn't move, just stood there. I swallowed hard and yanked the curtain aside. No one was there. I searched the darkness, my pulse hammering in my ears. The desert was empty, not even footprints in the dirt outside. I told myself I was imagining things. I double-checked the locks, grabbed my flashlight, and did a sweep around the RV. Nothing. But when I climbed back inside, my blood ran cold. The bed was messed up. Like someone had been lying there. I hadn't left it that way. I grabbed my keys, fully intending to drive the hell out of there, but when I turned the ignition, nothing happened. The engine was dead. Panic clawed at my throat. My RV was in perfect condition. There was no reason it shouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. Just the faint clicking of a useless battery. Then I heard my sister's voice. "Cassie, help me." I went rigid. My sister, Maria, had been dead for 2 years. I whipped around, expecting, what, a ghost? A hallucination? The door of the RV stood wide open. I hadn't opened it. The lights outside pulsed faster now, flickering in my periphery. My body screamed at me to stay put, to barricade myself inside, but my legs moved anyway. The desert air was ice against my skin as I stepped outside. Maria? My voice came out hoarse. The lights floated, shifting in the distance, and then I saw her. Maria. She stood 20 feet away, barefoot, wearing the old blue hoodie she used to steal from me. Her dark hair tangled in the wind, eyes wide with something between fear and sadness. "Cassie," she whispered. I took a step forward before my mind caught up. No, this isn't real. Maria was gone. I'd been there when she died. I'd held her in my arms after the car wreck. I'd heard her last breath, but she was there, watching me with wide, pleading eyes. Then she started walking toward the lights. I followed. I knew I shouldn't, but I did. I stumbled over the rocky ground, heart slamming against my ribs, breath shallow. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn back, but the lights pulled at me, Maria's figure drifting between them like a mirage. Then I saw the others. Figures. 6 standing among the lights. Their faces were wrong, blurry, stretched. Their eyes were black voids. I skidded to a stop. Maria turned to face me. But it wasn't Maria anymore. Her mouth stretched too wide, a hollow grin splitting her face. I took a shaky step back. The other figures moved closer. I ran. I didn't look back. I reached the RV, gasping, my lungs on fire. The door was still open. I jumped inside and slammed it shut, locking every latch with shaking hands. Then I turned, and my heart stopped. There was someone sitting in the driver's seat. Me. A perfect copy. Same tangled hair, same terrified expression, but it wasn't me. It smiled. "Leaving so soon?" It whispered in my voice. My vision blurred with panic. I lunged for my knife and swung. The blade passed through air. The thing laughed. Then, suddenly, it was gone. I turned the ignition, praying to every god I'd ever ignored. The RV roared to life. I didn't question it. I slammed it into gear and peeled out of there, tires spitting dirt and gravel. The lights in the distance flickered faster, like they were angry. But I didn't stop. I drove straight through the night, past Marfa, past anything familiar. When I finally stopped, the sun was rising, and my hands were shaking so hard I couldn't hold my keys. I should have felt safe, but then I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, and it smiled before I did. My name is Rick Dawson. I'm 38 years old, and what I'm about to tell you happened last summer in the Chisos Mountains of Big Bend National Park, Texas. I've seen some horrific things in my life. Combat zones, dead friends, hellholes halfway across the world. But nothing comes close to what I saw in those mountains. It started when Jake Ramirez, an old Army buddy, called me out of the blue. I hadn't talked to him in years. "Rick, man, you've been off the grid too long. Come out to Big Bend. I'm working as a ranger out here. And I've got the perfect spot for us to kick back. Bring your RV. Let's catch up." I should have known something was off. Jake had this weird tone in his voice, too chipper, like he was trying too hard. But hell, I'd been alone since the divorce, just me and my thoughts rattling around in that tin can I called home. Maybe I needed this. The drive from El Paso to Big Bend was long and desolate. Just endless stretches of desert and sky. By the time I pulled into the Chisos Basin campground, the sun was dipping below the mountains, casting long, jagged shadows across the land. Jake was waiting, leaning against his dusty Jeep, grinning like the devil himself. He looked older, leaner, with a scruffy beard and sunburned skin. Beside him was a woman I didn't recognize, Sierra. Late 20s, maybe, with dark hair tied back and eyes that studied me like she could see straight through. "Rick!" Jake pulled me into a hug, slapping my back hard. "Man, you look like shit." "Good to see you, too," I muttered, eyeing Sierra. "This is Sierra, my girl. She's been dying to meet you." She gave me a tight smile. "Jake's told me all about you. Army buddies, huh?" "Something like that." We set up camp, cracked a few beers, and tried to slip back into old rhythms. But it wasn't the same. Jake kept steering the conversation toward our tours overseas, but not in the nostalgic way. He wanted details, things I hadn't told anyone, how many people I'd killed, what it felt like. I brushed it off, but the way Sierra's eyes lit up when he pressed, it set something crawling in my gut. That night, after they went to bed in Jake's tent, I sat outside staring into the darkness. The desert silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural chant drifting on the wind. I froze, straining my ears. It was faint but unmistakable. Voices echoing off the canyon walls like some kind of ritual. I glanced toward Jake's tent, but no movement. The next morning, I brought it up. "You hear that chanting last night?" Jake shrugged. "Locals, probably. There's some weird folks out here." Sierra smirked. "Or maybe it's just the desert messing with your head, soldier." I didn't like her tone, but I let it go. We hiked deeper into the mountains that day, Jake insisting he knew a secret spot with a killer view. The trail was rough, barely marked, and the further we went, the more wrong it felt. About 2 miles in, we found it, an abandoned campsite. The tents were slashed open, their contents scattered. Blood smeared across the canvas and dirt, drying under the brutal sun. A cooler lay overturned, its contents rotting in the heat. Jake stared for a moment before muttering, "Mountain lions, probably." "No mountain lion did this," I snapped, pointing to the ground. "Those are boot prints, human." Jake exchanged a quick glance with Sierra. She looked excited, like this was some kind of game. I wanted to leave, every instinct screamed at me to get the hell out of there. But Jake insisted we stay one more night, said I was being paranoid. That night, everything went to hell. I woke up to a splitting headache and the taste of metal in my mouth. My arms were tied behind my back, rough rope biting into my skin. My head spun as I struggled to focus, realizing I wasn't in my RV. I was in some kind of cave, the walls damp and cold against my skin. Jake stood over me, smiling. But it wasn't the friendly grin from before. This was something else. Something darker. "Sorry, brother," he said, kneeling down. "But you were always meant for this." "What the hell are you talking about?" I rasped. "You've got sins, Rick, blood on your hands. The preacher says we all gotta be purified." Sierra appeared behind him, holding a knife. She crouched beside me, her breath hot against my ear. "You should have stayed in your little RV, soldier." They dragged me deeper into the cave, where the rest of them waited. The cult. Dozens of them, filthy and gaunt, their eyes hollow but burning with fanaticism. In the center stood the preacher, a tall, skeletal man with wild hair and a voice like gravel. "This one's seen death," he whispered, looking me over like I was a prized pig. But has he felt it? The next hours, or days, I don't know, were a blur of pain. They carved into me, asking questions about my past, my kills, my fears. But I didn't break. I couldn't. Somewhere in that fog of agony, I knew I had to survive. I waited for my chance. When it came, it was messy. One of the guards got too close, his knife gleaming in the dim light. I headbutted him hard and felt the crack of his nose under my skull. I grabbed the blade, slicing through my bindings as he screamed. Chaos erupted. I didn't hesitate. I drove the knife into his throat and ran. I stumbled through the darkness, my body screaming in protest. I found another captive, a woman, barely conscious. I tried to drag her with me, but she was too far gone. I left her behind. I had to. I made it back to the RV just as dawn broke, but relief was short-lived. Sierra was there, waiting, a shotgun resting casually in her arms. "Tough bastard," she said, tilting her head. "But you can't outrun us." I lunged before she could pull the trigger, the blast grazing my shoulder as I tackled her to the ground. The fight was brutal, clumsy, and desperate. But I had one thing she didn't: the will to survive. I left her bleeding on the ground, gasping like a fish out of water. But I wasn't done. I went back for Jake. I found him near the cave, trying to rally the others. He didn't see me coming. I took him down with a rock to the skull, then dragged him into the open, letting him see my face as I ended it. But the preacher, he was gone. I reported everything to the authorities when I finally made it out. But when they went back, the caves were empty. No signs of the cult. Just those same symbols, carved deep into the rock. I don't know where they went, but I know they're still out there, and I know they'll come for me someday. My name is Megan Carter. I'm 34 years old, and this happened last summer at Lake Meredith, near Fritch, Texas. I went out there thinking I could outrun my past, get some peace after a messy divorce, and figure out who I was without the constant noise of city life. But the lake had other plans. I bought this old RV off Craigslist, a clunky, beat-up thing, but it felt like freedom. The plan was simple: camp for a few days, hike, maybe kayak. No people, no questions, no reminders of the life I'd left behind. Just me, nature, and the quiet. But the quiet wasn't what I expected. The first thing I noticed when I pulled into the campground was how still everything was. Not peaceful still. Dead still. No birds, no wind, not even the hum of insects. The lake stretched out in front of me, smooth as glass, reflecting the dull gray sky like a giant, unblinking eye. I parked the RV close to the edge of a cliff overlooking the water. It was the kind of view that should have felt calming, but instead it set something uneasy in my chest. I chalked it up to nerves and fatigue. After all, I'd driven for hours to get here. That night, As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a bruised purple, I sat by the fire with a book, trying to unwind. The silence pressed in around me, heavy and unnatural. Then I heard it. Soft crying. At first, I thought it was an animal. But no, this was different. It sounded like a child. The hair on my arms stood up. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound down to the shoreline. The beam of light danced across the water, but there was nothing there. Just the lake, still in black, swallowing the light whole. I told myself it was my imagination. Maybe a distant camper I hadn't noticed. But when I woke the next morning, there were small wet footprints leading from the water to my RV door. I stood there for a long time staring at those prints. They were tiny, like a child's, and they stopped right at the threshold of the door. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I forced a laugh. Some local kids playing a prank, I thought, just kids. But the nearest town was miles away. That afternoon I decided to get out on the water. I figured sometime kayaking would clear my head. The sun was high, beating down on the lake, but the water was cold, colder than it should have been. As I paddled toward the center, I felt eyes on me. I stopped, scanning the shoreline. That's when I saw him, a boy, standing at the water's edge. He was maybe 7 or 8, with pale skin and dark hair plastered to his forehead. He wore old-fashioned clothes, shorts and a buttoned shirt, like something out of the 1950s. He waved at me, but there was something wrong with his face, his eyes. They were too dark, too deep, like empty holes. I paddled toward him, but when I reached the spot, he was gone. No footprints, no rustling in the bushes, just that same suffocating silence. That night, I locked the RV door and pulled the curtains tight. But around midnight, I heard it again, the crying. Louder this time, closer. I froze in my bed, heart pounding, listening as the sound moved around the RV like someone circling it. Then came the whisper, "Megan?" My blood turned to ice. No one knew I was here. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I mustered every ounce of courage and peeked through the curtain. There he was. The boy stood inches from the window, his face pressed against the glass, water dripping from his hair. His eyes met mine, black, hollow, endless. His lips moved, but no sound came out. I stumbled back, heart racing, and the lights flickered. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to leave. I didn't care how crazy it sounded. I wasn't staying another night. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the RV sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. My phone had no signal. Panic set in. I threw on my hiking boots and started down the dirt road, hoping to reach the main highway. But the further I walked, the more disoriented I became. The landscape twisted, unfamiliar. The lake was always in view, no matter which direction I went, as if it was following me. Hours passed. The heat became unbearable and my head throbbed. I turned back, exhausted, only to find the RV right where I left it, like I hadn't moved at all. That night, feverish and weak, I hallucinated. Or at least I thought I did. The boy stood inside the RV, watching me from the corner. His skin was gray, bloated, like he'd been in the water too long. His mouth stretched into a grin far too wide for his face. "You can't leave," he whispered. "The lake won't let you." I woke up at dawn, drenched in sweat, and found myself outside sitting in my kayak in the middle of the lake. I had no memory of getting there. The paddle was missing, and the water lapped at the sides, threatening to tip me over. I panicked, kicking at the water, trying to propel myself back to shore. But something cold wrapped around my ankle, yanking me under. I thrashed, my lungs burning, but the grip was unrelenting. I saw his face beneath the surface, his hollow eyes boring into mine. My vision blurred, darkness creeping in. But then something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to die here. I wouldn't let him win. With a surge of strength, I kicked free and clawed my way to the surface, gasping for air. I swam to shore, dragging myself onto the rocky beach, coughing up lake water and bile. I didn't wait. I ran straight to the RV, bare feet bleeding, and slammed the door shut behind me. I don't know how, but the engine roared to life on the first try. I didn't look back. I drove until the sun was high in the sky, until I saw other cars, other people. When I finally stopped at a gas station hours later, I went to wash my face in the bathroom. That's when I saw it. A small, wet handprint on my shoulder. It's been months since I left Lake Meredith, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of crying outside my window, and I know the lake is still waiting. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 41 years old, and this happened last fall in Bastrop State Park, Texas, right in the heart of the Lost Pines Forest. I went there to take photographs, but I left with something much darker burned into my mind. I'm a freelance photographer, landscapes, abandoned places, that sort of thing. After my wife, Laura, died in a house fire last year, I threw myself into work. It was the only thing that kept me going. Bastrop felt like the perfect destination. The forest there had been devastated by wildfires a decade ago, and I wanted to capture the way life was creeping back into the ash. I told myself I needed the solitude, that the quiet would help me process things. But the truth is, I was running from the house we shared, from the memories that clung to the walls like smoke. I thought the forest would be different. I was wrong. I arrived in Bastrop on a cool October afternoon. The air smelled faintly of pine and something else, something burnt. The trees were strange, a mix of fresh green needles and blackened trunks, standing like charred skeletons among the living. I parked my RV near an old trail called the Old Cart Path, far from the main campground. I wanted to be alone. The first day went fine. I hiked through the forest, snapping shots of the twisted, scorched trees against the bright sky. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest changed. The shadows grew longer, darker, and the silence settled in like a weight on my chest. That night, after editing some photos, I crawled into bed in the RV. The forest outside was deathly still. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence pressing in on all sides. Then I heard it. A voice. Soft, faint, almost like a whisper. "Ethan." I bolted upright, my heart pounding. I knew that voice. It was Laura's. I shook my head, telling myself it was the wind, or maybe a dream. But deep down, I knew better. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the RV sending fresh waves of anxiety through me. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just tired. Grief does weird things to the mind. I grabbed my camera and went back into the woods, determined to focus on my work. But as I reviewed my shots later, I noticed something strange. In the background of several photos, there was a figure. Tall, thin, almost human, standing among the trees. It wasn't there when I took the pictures. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow. But as I zoomed in, I felt my stomach drop. It was Laura, or something that looked like her. I tried to leave that afternoon. I didn't care how crazy it sounded. I wasn't staying another night. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the RV sputtered and died. I checked the battery, the fuel, everything. Nothing was wrong, but it wouldn't start. Then my phone went dead, fully charged 1 minute, completely lifeless the next. I felt the first real spike of fear then, cold and sharp in my chest. I wasn't just stuck, I was trapped. I decided to hike out to the main road, but the forest had other plans. Every path I took, every turn I made, I ended up back at the same spot. a small clearing where the trees formed a perfect circle. In the center of the clearing, lying in the dirt, was Laura's locket, the one she always wore, the one that should have burned with her. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It was ice cold, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. That night, the whispering returned. Louder this time, closer. "Ethan, come home." I covered my ears, but the voices seeped through, curling around my thoughts like smoke. I saw Laura's face in the windows, reflected in the dark glass, her eyes hollow and empty. The next day, desperate and exhausted, I stumbled across an old, abandoned ranger station deep in the forest. The door creaked open with a push, revealing a space covered in dust and cobwebs. Maps and old ranger logs littered the floor. As I flipped through them, I found references to something called the Bruxa. According to the notes, it was a spirit that haunted the forest, drawn to grief and sorrow. It preyed on the vulnerable, luring them deeper into the woods with the voices of their loved ones before consuming them. I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't Laura, it was something wearing her face, her voice, feeding off my pain. But knowing that didn't make it stop. That night, I woke up outside. I was lying in the clearing, the locket clutched in my hand, though I had no memory of leaving the RV. The moon hung low in the sky, casting everything in an eerie silver light. And there she was. Laura stood at the edge of the clearing, her skin pale and stretched too tight over her bones. Her eyes were black, bottomless pits. She smiled, but it wasn't her smile. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice both hers and not hers, "come with me." I stumbled back, heart racing, but the trees closed in, their branches clawing at my skin. I realized then that I couldn't run, I couldn't escape. The only way out was through. I remembered the old ranger logs, the stories of fire. The Bruxa fed on grief, but it feared purification. It feared fire. With shaking hands, I pulled out the small canister of camping fuel from my backpack and doused the locket. I struck a match and dropped it onto the metal, watching as the flames roared to life. The forest screamed. The sound was deafening, a chorus of agony and rage. Laura's face twisted, her mouth opening in a silent wail as the fire spread. The trees convulsed, their charred trunks cracking and splintering. I ran, the flames lighting my path, the screams echoing in my ears. When I reached the RV, I didn't look back. I turned the key, and this time, the engine roared to life. I drove until the forest disappeared in my rearview mirror, until the sun rose and the voices finally faded. It's been months since Bastrop. I've tried to move on, but some nights, when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long, I hear her voice again. "Ethan, come home." But I know better now. It's not Laura. It never was. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 34, and this happened last summer in Big Bend National Park, Texas. I wasn't looking for trouble, just some quiet. After my brother Caleb died last year, mysteriously, the military said, I'd been spiraling. My wife left, the bottle became my best friend, and eventually, my reflection started looking like someone I didn't recognize. So, I packed up my old RV and drove south, deep into the desert. I figured if the silence didn't fix me, maybe the solitude would. But out here, silence isn't peace, it's a predator. The first day in Big Bend was uneventful. The sun was brutal, the sky endless. The Rio Grande snaked lazily along the border, the only sign of movement in an otherwise dead landscape. I found a spot off the main road, parked the RV, and set up camp. The air conditioning groaned, but held on. I cracked open a beer, watched the sky turn from blue to blood red, and thought, maybe, just maybe, I'd find some clarity out here. But then night fell. The first sign something wasn't right came in the form of sound. Drums, faint, like echoes from another world, rumbled through the canyons. I figured it was just some campers partying, though I hadn't seen another soul for miles. But then, around midnight, Buck started growling. Yeah, Buck. My German shepherd. He's been my only constant since everything went to shit. He stared at the window, hackles raised, teeth bared at the darkness beyond. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped outside, and scanned the desert. Nothing. Just wind sweeping over rocks, rustling through scraggly brush. But there were symbols. I found them etched into the stones near my RV. Spirals. Crude stick figures with hollow eyes. I told myself they were just the remnants of some local kids messing around. But my gut twisted in a way I couldn't ignore. The next day, I decided to head into town for supplies. My water filter was busted, and the heat was unforgiving. That's when I met Lena. She was at the gas station, filling up an old, dust-covered Jeep. Dark hair pulled into a messy bun, sunburnt skin, eyes that seemed to flicker between warmth and caution. She caught me staring and smiled. "Not many folks out here this time of year," she said, nodding at my RV. "Yeah, that's kind of the point," I replied, trying to keep it light. We got to talking. She said she was a traveler, just passing through. There was an ease to her, a confidence that made me feel like I wasn't completely alone in this vast, empty place. She mentioned some hidden spots in the park, off-the-map trails where the real beauty of Big Bend revealed itself. "You should check out the springs," she said. "Most people don't know about them. It's peaceful." I should have known better, but loneliness does funny things to your judgment. Later that afternoon, I ran into Jesse and Mark on one of the trails Lena had mentioned. They looked like typical hikers. Sun-bleached hats, cargo shorts, two friendly smiles. They claimed they were heading to the same hot springs Lena had talked about and invited me along. Buck didn't like them. He growled low in his throat, but I chalked it up to his overprotective nature. We hiked for a while, the sun beating down like it wanted to peel the skin from my bones. The trail faded into nothing, just jagged rocks and dry earth. That's when I felt it. That creeping sense of wrongness, like eyes were on me even when no one was around. Then Jesse disappeared. One minute he was ahead of us, the next he was gone. I called out, but only the desert answered back. A hot wind carrying my voice into the void. Mark didn't seem worried. He shrugged, adjusted his pack, and muttered, "He probably wandered off. Happens." But I wasn't buying it. That's when I noticed the blood on Mark's backpack. Just a smear, like someone tried to wipe it clean but didn't do a thorough job. "What's that?" I asked, pointing. Mark's smile faltered. "What's what?" Before I could press, his fist connected with my jaw. The world spun. I hit the ground hard, the taste of blood filling my mouth. Buck lunged, teeth sinking into Mark's arm. But a sharp crack echoed and Buck yelped, collapsing beside me. I blacked out. When I came to, I was underground. A cave, dimly lit by flickering torches stuck into the walls. The air was thick with the stench of decay and something else, something metallic. I was tied up, my wrists raw from the rope digging into them. Buck was gone. I wasn't alone. There were others, 3 of them, slumped against the walls, their bodies mutilated in ways I can't even describe without wanting to vomit. One of them was Jesse. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, mouth frozen in a silent scream. That's when I saw Lena. She stepped out of the shadows, her smile as warm as it had been at the gas station. But now, it felt like a mask. Something stretched too tight over something rotten. "You were easy," she whispered, crouching beside me. "Caleb was tougher, but you You're soft." Hearing my brother's name snapped something inside me. "What the fuck are you talking about?" I rasped. Her smile widened. "Your brother found us years ago. He tried to leave. No one leaves." The cult emerged from the darkness then. Faces hidden behind crude masks made of animal bones and stretched skin. They chanted in a language that scraped against my sanity, their voices rising as they dragged another captive, Mark, now screaming, toward the center of the cave. They didn't kill him quickly. They made it slow, deliberate, savoring his screams as they carved into him. And all I could do was watch. Until I remembered the blade. Caleb's blade. He'd given it to me before his last deployment. Said it was lucky. I never believed in that kind of shit, but I kept it in my boot, even after everything. They'd missed it. With agonizing effort, I twisted my foot, dragging the blade toward my bound hands. My fingers screamed in protest, but eventually, the rope gave way. I moved fast. The first cultist didn't see it coming. The blade sank into his neck, hot blood spraying across my face. The others turned, but I was already moving, adrenaline dulling the pain. I grabbed one of their makeshift torches, swinging it wildly, the flames catching on the dry, brittle walls. The cave erupted into chaos. I found Buck on the way out, alive but limping. Together, we staggered into the desert night, the cult's screams echoing behind us. But the desert isn't kind to escapees. My RV was trashed, the tires slashed, supplies gone. The sun was rising, and with it came the searing heat. I stumbled through the canyons, Buck at my side, my throat raw, skin blistering. That's when Lena found me. She wasn't smiling now. Her face was twisted in rage, a knife glinting in her hand. "You can't run from us," she hissed. But I wasn't running anymore. We fought. It was brutal, desperate. She was fast, but I was fueled by something primal. I don't remember much, just the feeling of the blade in my hand, the warmth of her blood on my skin. When it was over, I left her there, her body baking under the unforgiving sun. I don't know how long I wandered before the Rangers found me. Their truck rumbled down the dusty road like a gift from the gods. They loaded me in, gave me water, and said I was lucky to be alive. But as we drove, I noticed something. One of the Rangers had a tattoo on his wrist, the same symbol they'd carved into me back in that cave. I met his eyes in the rearview mirror, and he smiled. My name is Claire Jennings. I'm 31, and this happened last summer in Terlingua, Texas. I was supposed to be chasing ghost towns, not becoming part of one. I'd been on the road for 2 weeks, living out of my beat-up RV, photographing forgotten places for a magazine spread. I loved capturing the decay, the quiet skeletons of towns long abandoned. But Terlingua felt different the moment I rolled in. The desert here wasn't just empty, it was waiting. I parked at a dusty RV park on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, just a few battered campers scattered across a dirt lot, the kind of place where people kept to themselves. The owner, an old guy named Tommy Green, sat on a rickety porch chewing tobacco and squinting at me like I didn't belong. "You here for the mines?" he asked, voice rough as gravel. "Just passing through," I replied, slinging my camera over my shoulder. "Doing a photo series on ghost towns." Tommy grunted, his gaze lingering a little too long. "Stay out of the mines, girl. They ain't right." I gave him a polite smile and went on my way. Locals always had stories, and I'd heard my share of warnings about haunted places. But it wasn't ghosts I was running from. It was Lily. My sister died a year ago. Car accident. I told her to drive home that night despite the storm, thinking it was no big deal. It was. She never made it. I hadn't picked up a camera since until this trip. I thought maybe photographing the dead would help me live again. But out here, the dead have a way of finding you. That first night in Terlingua, the desert was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears makes you feel like you're underwater. I sat in my RV, scrolling through photos, when I heard it. "Claire." My blood turned to ice. It was faint, just outside the window. I froze, listening. "Claire, help me." It was Lily's voice. I slammed the laptop shut, heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it was the wind, that I was tired, that grief was playing tricks on me. But when I finally worked up the courage to peek out the window, I saw footprints in the dirt. Bare feet, leading toward the old mines. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I wandered into the town's only bar, a dimly lit place that smelled like dust and stale beer. That's where I met Eva. She was sitting at the bar, nursing a whiskey. Her hair was tangled, and her eyes had that haunted look I recognized from mirrors. She smiled when she saw me. "You're new," she said. "Passing through?" "Something like that," I replied, sliding onto the stool next to her. We talked for a while, sharing road stories over cheap drinks. She seemed normal enough at first, but the more we talked, the more her eyes darted to the windows, like she was expecting something, or someone. "They come at night," she whispered, leaning in close. "Whispers in the dark. They look like people you know." I stiffened. "What do you mean?" Her gaze locked onto mine, and her voice dropped to a trembling whisper. "I saw my brother last night. He's been dead for 5 years." My stomach clenched. I left the bar feeling like my skin didn't fit right. I told myself Eva was just crazy, another drifter with too many ghosts. But that night the whispers came again. "Claire." "It's me." I bolted upright in bed, sweat-soaked and shaking. The voice was closer this time, right outside the RV. I grabbed my flashlight, heart pounding, and cracked the door open. She was standing there, Lily. Same blonde hair, same crooked smile. But her eyes, they were wrong. Hollow, black as the void. She didn't blink. "Come with me, Claire," she whispered. "I'm cold." I slammed the door shut, heart thundering in my chest. I stayed up the rest of the night, flashlight clutched in my trembling hands, waiting for dawn. But when the sun rose, the footprints were back. The next day, I went looking for Eva. Her RV spot was empty, her things scattered like she'd left in a hurry. I found a trail of footprints leading toward the mines. I should have left, should have packed up and driven as far from Terlingua as my RV could take me. But something pulled me toward those mines. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the hope that I could find Eva, that I wasn't going crazy. Or maybe it was Lily. The mines were a gaping wound in the earth, dark and yawning. The air grew colder as I stepped inside, my flashlight casting long, twitching halos on the walls. The deeper I went, the more the passages seemed to twist, looping back on themselves like the mine was alive. That's when I heard her. "Claire." It was Ava's voice now. I followed the sound, deeper and deeper, until the walls seemed to close in, pressing against my skin. I found her in a narrow tunnel, slumped against the wall, her eyes wide and glassy. "Ava?" I whispered, shaking her shoulder. She didn't respond. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I leaned closer, trying to hear. "They're here," she whispered finally. "They want you." That's when I saw them. Shapes in the shadows. Faces I recognized. My parents, Lily, even myself, staring back at me with hollow, empty eyes. The hollow ones. They surrounded me, their voices whispering in my head, feeding off my guilt, my fear. I felt their cold fingers on my skin, pulling me deeper into the darkness. But I wasn't ready to die. I fumbled for my camera, the one thing I still had control over. I clicked the flash, the bright burst of light searing through the darkness, blinding them. They shrieked, retreating into the shadows. I grabbed Eva's arm and ran, stumbling through the twisting tunnels, the Hollow One's screams echoing behind us. We burst out into the sunlight, gasping for air. But Eva collapsed, her body lifeless, eyes still wide and hollow. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my RV. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, heart pounding in my chest. I started the engine and tore out of Terlingua, the town shrinking in my rearview mirror. But I wasn't alone. I saw her in the passenger seat reflected in the mirror. Lily, smiling with those hollow eyes. And I knew then I'd never escape the Hollow Ones. They were inside me now. My name is Ryan Mercer. I'm 37, and this happened last fall at Sam Rayburn Reservoir in East Texas. I thought I could outrun the past. Thought a week of fishing, just me in the open water, would clear my head. But grief doesn't stay behind when you hitch up an RV. It comes with you. Sam Rayburn was supposed to be my escape. My ex-wife hated the outdoors, and I hadn't been back since Matt, my best friend, died in a boating accident there the year before. Maybe that's why I chose it. I needed to face it, or maybe I just wanted to feel closer to him again. The lake was quiet when I pulled in, the kind of quiet that feels heavy. The campground was mostly empty, just a few scattered RVs tucked under the pines. I parked mine right at the edge of the water, unhitched the small fishing boat from the trailer, and cracked open a beer. The air smelled like pine and waterlogged wood. It should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. I stopped by the bait shop the next morning. It was the kind of rundown place you'd expect in a town that barely got tourists anymore. Peeling paint, dusty tackle boxes, and the faint smell of mildew. The guy behind the counter looked like he'd been carved from the same wood as the dock outside. Grizzled, with deep lines around his eyes. "You planning on night fishing?" he asked, without looking up from the counter as I paid for some worms and line. "Maybe," I said. "Why?" He finally met my eyes, and there was something there. Something I couldn't place. Lake's different at night. Best you stay on shore when the sun goes down. I gave him a polite nod and left, chalking it up to small-town superstition. Every lake has its stories. But that night I started to believe him. It was just after sunset when I first saw her. I was sitting by the water, nursing a beer, watching the sky bleed from orange to purple. The surface of the lake was like glass, smooth and perfect. Then I saw movement. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw her clearly. A woman standing knee-deep in the water, wearing a white dress that clung to her like a second skin. Her hair floated around her like seaweed, and even though the water rippled around her legs, her reflection didn't move. I blinked and she was gone. I told myself I was just tired. Maybe I'd had one too many beers, but when I turned in for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing things, the soft splash of water, the creak of the dock, faint whispers that seemed to come from just outside the RV. I forced myself to ignore it, telling myself it was the wind or maybe some nocturnal animal. The next day, I met Travis. He was camped a few spots down from me, a lanky guy in his mid-30s with a sun-bleached cap and an easy grin. We struck up a conversation while I was hauling in my gear from the boat. "Good fishing out there?" he asked, nodding toward the lake. "Not bad," I replied. "You fish?" "Used to," he said, his smile fading a little. "But this lake, it's got something about it. You ever hear the stories?" I shook my head, though I already had an idea where this was going. They say there's a woman in the lake, drowned decades ago. She shows up to folks who've lost something, or someone, lures them in. I laughed it off, but something in the way he said it stuck with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things. At one point, I swore I heard Matt's voice, soft and distant, calling my name. Ryan. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. The voice came again, clearer this time. Ryan, come out here. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The night air was cool, and the lake shimmered under the moonlight. That's when I saw them. Wet footprints leading from the water's edge straight to my RV door. My skin crawled. I followed the prints back to the shore, shining my light over the water. Nothing. But when I turned to go back, I saw something in the corner of my eye. A reflection in the lake. It was Matt. He was standing on the dock, grinning like he used to when we'd reel in a big catch. But when I spun around, no one was there. Only his reflection remained, staring back at me from the water. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Travis was gone. His campsite was empty, his gear still there like he'd just stepped away for a minute. But his boat was out in the middle of the lake, floating aimlessly. Something was wrong. I got in my boat and motored out toward his. The closer I got, the colder the air felt, like I'd crossed some invisible line. I called out his name, but there was no answer. Just the soft lapping of water against the hull. When I reached his boat, it was empty, but there were scratches on the inside, like he'd tried to claw his way out. And then I saw her, beneath the water, her face pale and bloated, eyes wide open. Her mouth moved silently, as if singing. The woman in white. I panicked, tried to start the motor, but it sputtered and died. The boat drifted, and I could feel the pull beneath me, like the lake itself wanted to drag me under. Ryan. Matt's voice echoed in my head, louder this time, more insistent. I saw his face in the water, smiling, beckoning me. I grabbed an oar and paddled back to shore like my life depended on it, because it did. When I got back, I went straight to the bait shop. Old Man Grady was there, like he'd been waiting for me. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. I nodded, my throat dry. "She feeds on grief," he said. "Finds the ones who can't let go. That's how she gets in your head, makes you see things, hear things. If you don't fight it, she'll take you, just like she took the others." What do I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You have to let go of what's keeping you here," he said, "or she'll drag you down with her." That night, I sat by the water, staring at the lake. I thought about Matt, about how I blamed myself for his death. We'd been drinking that day more than we should have. I let him drive the boat back, even though I knew he was too drunk to handle it. The boat capsized and he didn't make it. But sitting there, I realized something. I wasn't in that water with him. I didn't force his hand. I'd been punishing myself for something I couldn't change. And maybe that's what she wanted. I heard Matt's voice again, closer this time. "Ryan, come on, it's okay. I'm here." I stood up, staring at his reflection in the water. But this time I didn't move toward it. I shook my head. "You're not him," I whispered. The reflection twisted, Matt's face morphing into something else. Something hollow and wrong. The woman in white rose from the water, her eyes empty, her mouth open in a silent scream. I grabbed a rock from the shore and hurled it into the lake. The reflection shattered, and the scream echoed through the trees, fading into nothing. The next morning, I packed up and left. I didn't look back, but as I drove away, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror, just for a second. Matt, sitting in the back of the RV, smiling.